So how does an association get to the place where their reserves are offsetting ongoing deterioration, providing just the right amount of cash in reserve so the board can perform all these major repair and replacement projects? Well, there's 4 factors: the physical makeup of the association's reserve balance, the amount of margin necessary to avoid a cash flow surprise, and the mathematical tool used to calculate reserve funding. In this portion of the webinar, reserve specialist Ian McGeady answers which 2 of these 4 factors you have control over, and he reveals how the results come together for your association's unique reserve funding recommendation. So, Ian, what affects the size of reserve funding obligations at an association?
Hi, Robert. Thanks. I appreciate you having me here today and with our audience. We're here to talk about how much is required to fund reserves at your association. It seems like a lot, but then again, roofing is expensive, asphalt is expensive, elevators are expensive. Really, the key to minimize your reserve funding needs is to spread them out nice and thin over the years. There are 4 factors affecting the size of your reserve fund recommendation. First is the components, the physical assets you're responsible for at your association to maintain. Some associations have more, some have less. This is custom to each association. If you missed it, we discussed reserve components in detail in our Reserve Studies 101 webinar. That webinar is available on our website and on YouTube. Next is your starting point, the size of your reserve fund. At this time, your reserve fund is strong, fair, or weak. Basically, you are in a good position, you are just keeping up with ongoing deterioration, or you're starting from way behind, and you have a lot of catching up to do in order to prepare for upcoming reserve expenses. We cover reserve fund strength and how it's calculated in our Reserve Studies 102 webinar. Again, if you missed that, both available are on our website and YouTube. Third is how much margin for unexpected assessments at your association. Basically, this amounts to how much you hate special assessments and how much cash cushion you want to maintain. And the fourth is a mathematical calculation tool used for crafting the funding plan. There are 2, the component method and the cash flow method. And making a wise choice is very important. I'll spend most of my time today on numbers 3 and 4, because those are the only ones where you have some choices to make. You're stuck with the components that you have for your association and the choices made by prior boards left you with the reserve fund strength you have today. But you have choices when it comes to 3 and 4. Briefly, I want to walk you through talk to you about reserve components. The first thing on our list here I want you to look at. When you look at this list, you may have a pool, roof, asphalt, many other components. Or you may not, it might be a smaller association. Your association has a list of reserve components the association is responsible to maintain. And as a board or a manager, they are your common area replacement responsibilities. If you ignore them, owners get dissatisfied and you increase your liability exposure. Besides, curb appeal is real. Caring for common areas maximizes your home values so much that the cost of reserve funding will actually look small. And just like the components, I'll briefly address the effect of your starting reserve fund strength. Your reserve fund strength is your starting point. Today's Wednesday. If you need to drive to New York City by the end of the week, you see the red star here. You'll be nice and close. For example, if you're at the Blue Dot in Boston. It's a little more challenging if you're starting in Charlotte, where I live. And the challenge only increases how far you are away, like Dallas or Los Angeles. Your reserve components are all deteriorating, and your roof is going to fail. It's in your best interest to be ready, to be close to your target destination. If you are starting out from behind or you are a long ways away, it means you're going to have to really hustle to build your reserve fund in time so you have cash to perform that project. So now we can talk about things you actually have some ability to affect these results. Typically, your reserve study professional will have a recommendation for your association about how much margin is appropriate. But I want to let you know that this is a factor, and it does make a little bit of difference. Here, I'm showing you a set of reserve study expenses scattered over the years. You want a funding plan that will provide these expenses, like this line shown, so that there is enough in your reserve fund to do these projects when expected. But because nothing ever happens exactly according to schedule, it's a good idea to have a little margin in your plan. The majority of reserve funding goes straight to these expenses, but a little margin can go a long ways when it comes to making life smoother at your association. So, how much margin is good? Let me show you what that looks like to have no margin. So this chart that you're looking at shows an association pursuing a baseline funding plan, where at some future point in your reserve study balance will fall very close to zero or just barely cash positive. They technically have enough cash to do all their projects, but they are at a pinch point. And when cash is near zero, that's what can happen. And that's when the association risks a special assessment if things don't go exactly according to plan. Fortunately, National Reserve Study standards define 3 funding goals: baseline, which I just showed you; threshold, which is a chosen dollar or percent funded amount that you will stay above; or full funding, which means the goal of having cash on hand equivalent to your amount of deterioration. Here's what that means for your association. When you are baseline funding, your association, your reserve fund will approach 0% funded for the few years surrounding that critical pinch point. In those years, statistically speaking, this chart shows you have around 50% chance of a special assessment. That's the red zone on the far left. Let's say you choose a threshold value of a certain dollar amount, or its equivalent as a percent funded amount. Let's say you choose 50% funded, just to illustrate this point. Staying at 50% funded means you keep your special assessment risk under 10%. That's pretty good. Having an additional margin in your reserves has significantly dropped your special assessment risk. And then there's full funding, our normal recommendation at association reserves. Not only is this easily defendable goal, but your reserve fund is the same size as the value of the reserve that's already deteriorated. It also means your special assessment risk is close to zero. That means associations pursuing a full funding goal basically don't have special assessments. And the good thing is that your margin choices aren't a big deal when it comes to the size of your reserve funding recommendations. That's because your reserve expenses are so large, the little more that you kind of set aside provide some margin is just that, just a little more. Looking at our clients, the difference in reserve funding between what it takes to pursue just baseline funding or full funding is about 10 to 20%. Not a big difference in the size of your reserve transfers. And there's a real benefit dropping that risk of special assessments from about 50 to almost zero. Now that's peace of mind. And that brings us to our last topic, the method used to calculate the funding requirements. Like before, we're presuming the component expenses are set. This is just like a discussion about the method used to calculate the reserve funding needs. Unlike a carpenter or a plumber, you don't really care which brand of drill or saw or some other brand, or even the power tool or the hand tool that they have. You just want the job done and done well. That's not true with reserves. The choice of the mathematical tool makes a big difference in results. Typically, this choice is made by your reserve study professional, selecting what's best for your association. And the choice is clear. No competition, actually. Between the component method, also called straight line, or the cash flow method, also called pooled, The cash flow method is the clear winner. Very simply, it is more flexible and more advantageous to your association. The funding profile over the years can be crafted to maximize smoothness and fairness to all the owners. And it is also easily adjusted to provide more or less funding margin, as I spoke about a moment ago. So why would anybody choose the component method? This topic is significant, primarily for some of our associations in Florida, or for our associations in Florida, where by state law, this is the method that needs to be used unless they officially choose to allow their reserve study professional to use the more powerful and advantageous cash flow method. This is also significant for individuals preparing a reserve fund on a spreadsheet, people who are building their own reserve funding plans. And that's because the component method is very simple. Just do a calculation for each component, one at a time, that is key, and then sum it up at the bottom of the list. So it's kind of like an up and down way to calculate reserve funding requirements. I'll explain it in this way. Let's take a second component from that list, the pool resurfacing that you can see here highlighted in yellow. This is a $10,000 project that needs to be done every 10 years. With that in mind, when the pool is new, you have 10 years to collect that $10,000. So your reserve funding requirements are $10,000 divided by 10 years, which is $1,000 per year. Pretty simple. If the association doesn't make all the budgeted reserve transfers and gets to the 5-year point and only has $2,500 set aside, instead of $5,000, the association needs to have the remaining $7,500 needed to prepare for that $10,000 expense. That's $7,500 over 5 years. So now the reserve funding needs this component to be at $1,500 per year. Getting a little behind has made the reserve funding 50% higher for this specific project. Now let's look at the association and get a few more years down the road. And let's say they're still behind on their reserve fund, not having all the funds set aside that they should. So let's say they are at the 8-year point with only $6,000 set aside. That means they need to collect the remaining $4,000 in the next 2 years, or $2,000 per year. Their reserve funding needs calculated to be twice that they originally expected. But let's say they're able to get it done, collecting enough to get that project completed. Then their cycle is reset, and they're back having 10 years to collect that, again, that we talked about, that $10,000. That, of course, means their reserve fund needs the component drop back down to $1,000 a year again. This example illustrates the problems with the component method of funding, where the boards find themselves get behind, and then funding the requirement begins to climb pretty steeply, but then resets after the expense. Funding plans calculated with the component method, again, some people call it the straight line method, where each component's reserve funding requirement is calculated separately, tend to be high in the first few years and then dropping as that project gets accomplished. That's a very different profile from the multi-year funding plan crafted with the cash flow or pooled method. With the cash flow method, you can create a funding plan that is smooth over the years, gradually floating upwards with inflation. If you remember the 4 funding principles Robert showed at the beginning, this type of funding plan very nicely meets the equitable distribution funding principle. This is possible because with the cash flow method, each individual component does not need to be funded separately from others. They all share one reserve fund so that there is no rush in the last few years of the component's life. The reserve income and the reserve expenses are smoothly balanced through the years because all of the reserve funding goes into the big pool together. And all of the expenditures come out from that same pool. No rushing. There is total sharing. This means funds can be used more efficiently than being divided up into separate accounts in different locations, one for each component. When I show them side by side, it's pretty clear. The same net funds go into reserves over the years. It's just the cash flow method doesn't force associations to pay a steep price in the first few years, to rapidly resolve the underfunding they might have. So that same total income for the same total expenses. But the cash flow method is and will always be a more efficient use of the association's reserves, and will always be more favorable to the vast majority of associations in the country that find themselves at least somewhat underfunded. It makes life in an underfunded association so much more palatable. What's important to note is that the initial year funding requirements calculated with the component method are regularly about twice as much as the funding requirements calculated by the cash flow method. That's why we so clearly state it's best to avoid the component method. Reserve professionals across the country avoid it. The only place in the country where reserve study professionals calculate funding plans with the component method is in Florida. And they do that only for clients who haven't yet officially opted over to the cash flow method. If you're calculating on your own reserve funding requirements this way, where each component's reserve needs are funded individually, stop. Hire a reserve study professional and let them create a smoother funding profile for your association using the cash flow methodology that isn't so expensive the first few years of the plan.
I might add also, it saves a whole lot of accounting headaches when you've got one $5,000 reserve transfer you're trying to make, and you have to divide it into 27 different components worth of little tiny buckets.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, okay. At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.